Now. Yes, it is. Here we go. So how's everybody doing?
Doing great.
Good. All right. Well, welcome. And I see we've got some new guests here. It's like we have one or two people from Coast Flying School out in San Diego. Welcome. And a few others. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So what we're going to cover today. Oh, can everybody see the PowerPoint, by the way? Is there anyone that can't see it?
Looks good.
Okay.
Good.
All right. We're going to have the comments from the last meeting, any DMS issues. One of the things we're going to talk about today has been requested by a few of the instructors in flight schools is SRM, ADM risk management issues with trying to create some sort of standardization or consistency and how that's tested. We talk about checklist usage of the different methods that can be accomplished, our point of contact reports. We're going to discuss some IFR clearances to be used on check rides. The AA, AFM, POH application dates, which we're going to cover from the last meeting. I've got excerpts from Craig's letter that sent out to us regarding what we discussed before. We're going to talk about systems and equipment malfunctions and trying to vary those a little bit on check rides where it's not just the standard. We know we have the engine failure one to do, but there's some other malfunctions that we could be looking at testing to vary it up just a little bit. And then along with those lines is that the FSDO response to the AFM POH page that we had from the last meeting. So first of all, any comments from the last meeting? I give everybody time to turn their microphone on. Okay, nothing there. DMS, any DMS issues? I can't help too much in that, but we've got Jeff on board, so and Rock, so they may be able to help with some of those.
I have a quick question on
Yep.
DMS.
Yep.
Have they done anything on that balloon deal? Where if you have somebody that has a balloon rating, it doesn't put it on there. I had two of them last month, and they told me DMS just said that they're supposed to straighten it out, but it's not in there. And like
What issue was that?
What's that?
What issue was that?
The issue was that they had balloon ratings, and when I printed up the temporary, it didn't put the balloon rating on.
Really?
And so I had to do an amended, a corrected file on both of them. And I called and took a couple days for them to get back to me. And they says, yeah, it's a problem. And it's just not going through in IACURA and DMS. I wrote a little letter with DMS about it too. Maybe it was more of an IACURA issue than it was DMS.
Yeah, see, Neil, you go the other way, so
Yeah.
that's probably not something that you're running across.
Well, it's been a while since I've done a check ride just because COVID shut everything down. But no, I haven't run into that.
Okay.
All right, I was just wondering anyone else. I had to do corrected files on both of those and send them back in. And they said they were supposed to be writing it to where IACURA would straighten all that out pretty quick.
Okay. Any other DMS issues?
Hey, Phil, this is Wesley Cash.
Yes, it is.
How are you, sir?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. So a reminder that DMS is going to be under maintenance in the morning. That alerts in IACURA. I think it was 9 Central for a few hours. But as far as DMS goes, when you submit an notice of disapproval, the report initially will not go through when you submit it. All the data is filling out, which is really nice. That's great that they finally fixed that. But when you try to click submit, it doesn't go through. So the way to get around that, I've found, and I spoke with Michael Phillips about it as well, is you just have to save it. And then once you save it, if you go back into it again and you go through and just make sure all the fields are completed, I think you have to re-input the flight time because it wants the decimals in there, but then it will go through. So if anybody else is having that problem, that's how you fix it.
Got it, thanks. Anything else regarding DMS? Nope, okay. Let me just, I'm getting a screenshot here of whoever FBO is. If you could, just associate a name with it. That'll help. So I can list the attendees for the blurb that goes out for the YouTube video stuff. Okay. All right. Whoops. Back here. A couple things. All right. So single pilot resource management, ADM, risk management. I'm getting a lot of calls and questions from a few DPEs and a lot of the instructors on how to train for this task, which obviously we know is in each area of operation. They've added that with the ACS. And I have to, I know that there was very little training done. Some of us came from an environment that dealt with threat and error management, which is all part of all this stuff, and studied this stuff pretty well, plus had pretty good programs on how it was taught. A lot of that is proprietary to the actual airline, so I'm not really at liberty to pull some of that stuff out. It would be great if I could, because it really would help out a lot with understanding the concept. But some of the questions that are asked is how can the students, schools, and the rest of us try to standardize and be consistent with how we test it. Obviously, this is normally going to be a scenario method more than anything, instead of saying, what if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? You want to really create a scenario and see how they determine, in one case, in some cases, multiple malfunctions or issues, and how they sort those out in a priority type situation. So how is it trained? How do we evaluate it? And what is the FAA-DP looking for on the check ride? So I'm asking anybody that's in here today to offer any information on how they train it or test it and where we could go from there. I know this is not going to happen today, where it's going to get probably close to being resolved, but my attempt is to try to create some sort of standardization or consistency for our customers out there so they can get an idea what really needs to be covered, because it's probably one of the most non-black and white issues because it's so relative to the actual event that's presented to the applicant as to how they would handle it. Does anybody have any comments regarding this? Nothing? Does anyone?
Yeah, this is Wesley. I'll just right off the top, I just opened up my ACS for commercial and I did a couple add-ons today, but if I want to start talking about systems, well, then I would just talk about, what happens if this message is displayed. So right off the bat in the ACS, it says for risk management, the first item is failure to detect system malfunctions or failures. So if you tell them that a certain CAS message or is displayed and they fail to recognize that, or it's walk me through it. So what does it mean? Why is it there? And then you can just transition to that from, okay, well, let's talk about the electrical system. If you get an alternator failure, master warning, what steps do you take? Okay, so there's the steps you take. And then you can just go from there. You can say, all right, well, describe the electrical system for me. You know, that's how I do it.
Okay. Since you brought up the electrical system, one of the, as I train the CFIs that I get who've already been through 3 check rides, I have to tell you, I am still curious as to when I asked them after you started the engine up, obviously we look at the oil pressure, and I said your ammeter is showing to the right on 0 to the left. What does that mean? What is that? What are you thinking now at this point? Or are you even looking at it? So now we get into a situation where do they even understand that there's an issue with the electrical system? And even though they may be going to, you know, from Chandler to Casa Grande, is this still a good, in the middle of the day, is this still a good idea? So I kind of use some of what you're doing, Wesley. More or less, I'll give them things like you have an alternator failure and low pressure, low oil pressure. So what am I looking for there? I'm looking for them to prioritize the issues. So what's the first thing they really want to be thinking about? Well, it's probably the engine more so than the alternator. That's what you're hoping to hear them say. So when we also talk about resources, single pilot resource management, the passenger, even though we're sitting in there as an evaluator, they do have the option to ask us as a passenger, because we tell them they're taking us somewhere, right? Usually, hey, could you do me a favor and grab the POH from behind the seat? I don't see anything wrong with it. Examiner / passenger grabbing the POH from behind the seat. He's using the resource. He's using air traffic control to maybe get some other information that he may want. He might make a radio call to another person out in the practice area wanting to know if there's some sort of an issue with a certain area that might be too crowded to be doing any maneuvers. So this is a tough one because there's really not much out there in the way of training. I know that the FAA PowerPoints don't really show that much in regards to all of this stuff. So it's kind of, upon us to come up with some sort of standardization or consistency on, what we're actually looking for, which is exactly what's written in the ACS, but it can become very vague. But I think, yes.
I'm sorry, I thought you were wrapping up there, Phil. Scott here. So, there is some obviously things written on this in the different booklets and ACs we have available. But this to me is something more of a one of those subjective things on a test. And I'll give you an example of how I evaluate SRM. And I even brief this to the applicant. Is it giving them a head up? No, because if they're not already used to doing this, it ain't going to matter how many times I say it. But as we get ready to go fly in my pre-flight brief, I talk to them about SRM and I remind them what my role is. I'm a passenger. Some of them are still wondering, am I logging, dual received on this check ride? And so I make it very clear, I'm a passenger. Although I can fly in real life, obviously I'm not going to unless I have to. However, what does a pilot do when they're a single pilot, as all these tests, at least most of these tests we do fulfill? Some of the most basic stuff is to have the standby radio frequency tuned. This is especially important on, as you know, instrument check rides, have the next frequency in there. And I'll tell them this straight up. I'll say, I'm going to evaluate you on single pilot resource management. You need to have a neat and tidy cockpit. Next radio frequency, if you have any clue what it could be, should be tuned in there when you're just doling along straight and level. And I give them those type of examples, and then I simply evaluate them on it. And if we do simulated, I pretend that there's a Casa Grande Tower and Phoenix approach while I'm in the stack doing the admin calls. And if they're even though I reminded them right before the flight, if they're not doing it, then that starts to raise a little checking on my part if, is this person ready to fly out there all by themselves in the national airspace system. So yes, extremely difficult to standardize. But I think the evaluation is so subjective, like I said, that this is one of those things that isn't black and white, in the PTS or the ACS.
You're right. And when I use the word standardization, I don't mean use the same exact examples, but just like what you just did, Scott, is first of all, in the briefing, advise them that you're looking for that, because I'm not sure that's covered in all the briefings, that you're actually going to be looking for SRM in this process and ADM. A lot of the people that I talked to said that those weren't even really mentioned and only was very touched upon during the oral portion, to fill in the square, so to speak, for the area of operation, like weather. One of them is risk management is, what does it mean if you don't get a good weather briefing? Well, it's pretty wide open. A lot of things can happen. And I'll even ask them, I said, what is the difference between risk management and aeronautical decision making? And a lot of them think it's the same thing. If you look in the FAA references, risk management is basically what you're doing before you go flying. And aeronautical decision making is what you do once you get in the airplane. And of course, single pilot resource management happens all the time. It happens while you're preparing for your flight on the ground and as well as in the airplane. So I know that there's not really a really good amount of definition of what these things actually mean. So what I'm just trying to accomplish here is you're right. It's very subjective, but we have to cover these in each area of operations. So mostly I think what the instructors are looking for is some sort of concept of how would the examiner evaluate this. He might offer them a scenario of some type, and it doesn't have to be the exact scenario, but Mr. Examiner, how do you evaluate risk management? Well, I give them a scenario, or I give them a situation where they might have to make a decision to go or no go, other than just the weather. So to go back to that electrical issue, I'm surprised, I shouldn't be surprised, how many people don't even understand that you probably should be looking at the ammeter or load meter, even though it's not listed that way, right after you start up an engine and see what it's doing. Before you get out to the runway, do your run up and find out it's been in a negative indication the whole time, and there you go blasting off IFR or VFR, but you're going to run out of electricity. So these are some of the things that I throw out there, as well as that stuff. So mostly what everyone's looking for, and like I said, this isn't going to happen today, but it was asked to be put in this program to try to find out. It's not as objective as a short field or soft field landing. That's obvious, but it's something that I think we're finding out, especially in the last couple of weeks with the accidents we've been reading about. Is it's not a physical ability to hold 100 feet, 10 degrees of heading and 10 knots of airspeed that's causing what we've experienced just in this neck of the woods in the past month and a half.
Guys here, if you care.
It's been deciding to make
No, that's fine. I'm elated that he's here, so.
Yeah. Hey, Lonnie, if you can hear me, we can hear you. Anyway, I think that, we're looking at, unfortunately, an increase in some accidents, especially around this area, that were more or less contributed to making a bad decision, as opposed to, being able to hold your altitude, airspeed, and heading within the confines of what we're looking for. So we're trying to figure out a way to get that across to more people, that that's just as important, if not more important, than the black and white issues associated with the check ride. So my favorite statement, I think, is made by somebody in the military, is that superior pilot's the one who uses superior judgment to avoid having to use the superior skills. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do with that. And that's probably a good way to start off any training in that. We have enough references with the, of course, the PHAC has it, but the risk management handbook itself is full of many of the issues that we're looking at. Hazardous attitudes, are we seeing that with individuals on check rides? And do we even discuss that? Do we ask them what they think they have? That's one of the questions I used to ask was, of the 5 hazardous attitudes, which one of those do you think apply to you more than anything? I didn't say, do any of them apply to you? I just asked, which ones do you think apply to you? So they kind of had to evaluate a personal evaluation on what they think their background is. Any other comments?
Hey, Phil, this is Bill Scott.
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious to know what some of the other DPEs have done, if they've noticed an excessive use of the EFB during a check ride, say an instrument check ride, where the applicant is just maneuvering the airplane on the iPad, not really using the instruments in the airplane. And would a DPE actually turn the Bluetooth off so the applicant couldn't do that, and then just focus on the instruments in the airplane? Has anybody run into that situation?
Bill, I actually have that on the list here, but since you brought it up now, that kind of will fall into this under single pilot resource management. Obviously, the iPad is a resource, and how much do we want to depend on that? So go ahead and finish off the scenario that you and I discussed. Let's see how the group feels about that, because we're not trying to take away resources necessarily on purpose, but there are going to be times when an iPad does fail, or a chart gets lost, gets blown in the back of the airplane, or a knob falls off of a radio or something like that. So go ahead and finish that particular scenario, and then you'll probably get an answer from.
Well, it was a situation which I had a friend. I'm obviously not doing instrument rides, but I had a friend doing an instrument check ride, and he noticed that the applicant was mainly using the iPad from start to finish. When they started, he was using it, but he really noticed it in the hold. The applicant was doing a hold. This was in California, and so he asked the applicant to turn off the Bluetooth, take a screenshot of the approach plate where the hold was depicted, and do the hold. And it was so distracting for the applicant, he was unable to do it. He was unable to hold on the holding side, and it got so bad that he couldn't even stay within 300 to 400 feet of his altitude. And so, the DPE, after it was all over, caught a little bit of flack for it. The instructor thought that he shouldn't have done that, but the DPE's reason for doing it was, well, what if that iPad were to fail and you were in the soup? And what are you going to do then? So anyway, I was just curious how everybody else would look at that.
Hey, this is Jim. I'll comment on that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So we all know there's a fine line between a tool and a crutch. And part of our job as DPs is to evaluate failures of different systems and different tools. So I think all of us here will agree that taking away the iPad in that situation is absolutely appropriate, because we need to see that they can fly the airplane and not fly the iPad. My only other comment would be, as DPs, I think we should be careful to use the scenario or apply the scenario in a realistic way. And for example, when I do that type of thing on an instrument check ride, we're simulating that we flew into an area with GPS jamming from the military. So their GPS stops working, which usually forces them to do a VOR approach that we need to do for the check ride. But I'll also disable their iPad and make it so they don't have their own chip on the iPad, because if you don't have GPS, you don't have GPS. And the applicants that I've tested seem to be well prepared for that. I've never had anyone like actually flying the iPad as bad as you just shared, Scott. But it's definitely something that should be trained for, and it's a scenario that's possible, and we need to keep it realistic. So I would caution the DP from being like, oh, I'm just going to take away your iPad because I feel like it. Well, what's the scenario? Is it GPS jamming? Is it the iPad battery died? Is it the iPad overheated? I mean, there should be a scenario behind the losing of the tool.
Well, whether there was a scenario or not, I don't know. I agree with you on that. So anyway, I was just curious. So thanks, Jim.
Hey, Phil, it's me.
Yes.
You know, I've had several check rides where not only were they concentrating way too much on an iPad, they also do it with the screen of the GPS. And as a result of this, I've found several people that did a great job of flying, but had no clue how to use an OBS. I mean, they couldn't use that because they never really were taught to do that. They were doing all this following the little magenta line, following their iPad. And so, you know, I mean, I think we have an obligation to check that they can use all of the equipment that's in front of them. And sometimes we forget to ask them to use that other equipment, and it's a result of too much iPad, too much magenta line on the GPS screen, all of those things.
No, I agree. And I think that the key is to give them the scenario. For instance, airplanes that have a Garmin 430 or 530 in the number one slot and a regular KX 155 or 165 in the second slot is a good scenario where the GPS fails. The Garmin just simply failed. Great breaker popped on it. Reset, didn't work. So now we're just down to one radio. It's very realistic. And now they do have to use. They don't have a map, and they do have to use the OBS mode and go back to basic OBS CDI issues. I think it's all in how we present the scenario to them, to put them in a situation where we didn't just simply turn it off. There's a reason it failed. And the reason it failed is a real world reason, an electrical system issue. I am still curious how many people want to turn off the Garmin 430 or 530 when they've lost the alternator and they're downloading equipment. And once again, the concept that they tell me is, well, it's got a big screen on it. It's probably using more electricity, when if they would simply look at the circuit breakers, they'd find that the 430, being a newer piece of equipment, uses less electricity than that KX 155 does. This is some of the stuff that's not taught to them. So once again, in resource management, do the pilots really know what they really need with a loss of electrical power? That's all part of it. Is what is it that I really need? What resources do I have left if my alternators failed and I'm down to battery power? And that's the kind of stuff we're looking for, is presenting scenarios where they can actually make a decision. Well, do I use number one or number two? Okay, now they have to make a decision. So there's some aeronautical decision making right there, where they have to select which radio do they want to keep. And, for obviously the one with the map on is the better one. And as it turns out, from an electricity, from a load situation, the 430s use less than that KX 155 does. So, or if you have two 430s, you don't need them both. Turn one off. So it's good. I appreciate some of the discussion on this. This is gonna be a while, because it's one of the areas that is not touched on very well with a lot of the instructors. Simply just don't know how to teach us stuff. They simply, are looking at a particular scenario. What would you do in this case when there's a lot more to it? One of them would be things like prioritizing your task, which they call task management. Do they really know how to use the autopilot? That's all part of it too.
Well, in Phoenix this time of year, you may have a realistic scenario where the iPad overheats. So there's your scenario right there.
Oh, I have I used to have a picture of my iPad with the little thermometer on it. because it really did overheat. And of course, I couldn't take a screenshot of it with that actual iPad. I had to use my mini to take a picture of it. And I just had a transfer made of that. And I just laid that over their iPads at times. Said, what's this? Oh, your iPad just overheated. Okay. I gave them an actual picture of an overheated iPad and said, what would you do in this case? And then
And that's also a risk management item that you were just talking about, which is in the instrument ACS, the limitations of electronic flight bag. So
Sure.
there
I had a gentleman from, and it was Transpac at the time, who we were doing an instrument ride. And we were finishing up, I don't know, coming back into Deer Valley. I don't remember if that was the landing that was going to happen or what, but his iPad overheated. He had paper charts with him, and he had a paper chart for the approach into what do you call it, into Deer Valley. In his side pouch there. He was all prepared for it. Apparently this had happened to him before, since we were doing a check right about the same time of day he was used to doing his lessons. And what he did was he took the iPad off the holder on the yoke. He set it down on the floor out of the sun. And about 10 minutes later, because we were doing holding or something like that, 10 minutes later, the iPad came back to life. He had his paper chart there. He left it on the floor because he didn't want to lean down and pick it up while he was shooting an approach, and did his approach with the paper, but he also had the iPad down there too. I mean, this is something you can't really teach somebody. This guy just took it to a whole nother level, and it was just great to see something like that. But yes, it is. It's what would you do today? It's now getting to be that time of year, and we're going to do this check ride, the flying portion at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're going to be facing a direction where the sun's shining bright in the cockpit. Is there any chance or anything you can think of we might run into? Oh yeah, my iPad could overheat. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a couple paper charts with me too. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about that can be taught to these individuals. It's not just something they just have to experience. Any other comments? Well, what I'd like is any input that you guys come up with, outside of the meeting that you have ways of training it or evaluating it. Just trying to create some sort of a way for us to disseminate some information to our customers out there to give them a little more insight into how to train for it, as well as the different ways that it can be evaluated. Okay, anything else regarding that? Nope. Okay, checklist usage. So there are various methods that we can use. We can do the read and do. We can do a challenge response. We can do a flow followed up by a checklist. And then we have to concern ourselves with which ones are memory items, which ones aren't. So the reason this came up is because some comments, phone calls from individuals. Well, I had a DPE who didn't like the fact that the applicant did everything without a checklist and then backed it up with a checklist. So I don't see any problem with that. The checklist was still used. It even mentions in our documentation that they can do whatever they need to do and back it up with a checklist, time permitting. Obviously, there's what's not taught very well is the fact that if there's 8 items on a checklist, the applicant doesn't have to do all 8 at one time. This is something that will definitely cause a loss of control of the aircraft, depending on what the situation is, especially if they're under the hood and they're looking down at their checklist. It's usually not straight out eye level like a chart might be. So just like some input on what the group thinks or individuals think, and even the guests, for those of you that are sitting here as guests, I encourage you to make any comments that you want or have any questions you want, because the whole idea behind this, since we do this, is to get the information out there to both sides of the check ride. So any comments on the checklist usage? What are we looking for when there's an anomaly with the aircraft, a system malfunction? So let's take the alternator, for example. The alternator fails, and not all the airplanes have a master caution or a warning light. So most of them do, but a lot of them don't. Cessnas have either a high voltage or a low voltage light, as well as the indicator. Pipers, of course, have that nice yellow master caution up there. But what is it we're looking for when it comes to the usage of a checklist? Are we looking for them to start grabbing it right away? Are we looking for them to troubleshoot and then grab a checklist?
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
What's everyone's opinion of pre-flight procedure? Before you get into this anymore, what's everyone's opinion of pre-flight procedure where it says under the skills that inspects the airplane with reference to an appropriate checklist? I don't see that as a read and do. I don't see that as anything except, excuse me, I don't see that as anything but a read and do. What do you think? Anybody?
I'll throw in a couple comments. So I don't think that particular example is saying that it has to be read and do. It doesn't say when the checklist is referenced, but this is actually a great example, I think, of many things that we have in aviation where, it's great that we all have different experiences. We all have different opinions on how things should be taught and what should be emphasized. I think it's important that we all remember as DPs that, we're representing the FAA, and we always need to go back to what does the FAA say? And, part of the reason that these discussions are so great is because there's a lot that the FAA does not say, and there is room for interpretation. But on that particular example, I would just go by what does it say? Again, I don't have it in front of me, but you just.
I'll read it to you right now.
Yeah, go ahead. What's it
I'm
say?
reading out of the private right now, the private ACS. And it says the applicant demonstrates the ability to inspect the airplane with reference to an appropriate checklist. And the only reason that I bring this up is because during a pre-flight, it is so easy, if they don't have a checklist, to miss a lot of items. They get sidetracked with looking at the brakes. They get sidetracked with, draining the fuel or whatever the case may be. And then they go back. And if they're doing this by memory, I guarantee you there isn't anyone that's going to walk around there, do it by memory and not forget an item. And so I've always interpreted it as this is a time when I like to see a read and do. I don't make them do a read and do. I've never failed anyone for not doing a read and do, but I've told people to go get a checklist once they forgot a couple things or they overlooked a couple things. But I don't know. I mean, my interpretation of it is I think they need to have a checklist in their hand, even if they walk out and do the whole wing, then they look down at it and they go through it and go, yeah, I got everything on the wing. But I don't think the checklist belongs in the cockpit like a lot of people do. And for years, let me go grab an old PTS. The PTS used to say that they had to have it. Let me go look.
Well, I certainly don't disagree with you. And, whether the term with reference as opposed to then reference, if the FAA really cares whether they do it as a flow checklist or do verify or, whatever. But I think the more important or maybe more common misconception is what is a checklist? And I don't put too much on my personal YouTube channel, but this is one that I feel so strongly about. If you want to just Google Jim Pittman checklist on YouTube, it should pop up. I've got a little 3-minute video there, but basically referencing what the FAA has to say on the topic. I think it's important that people understand that things like GUMPs do not constitute a checklist unless it's written down. Now, if someone wants to type out the GUMPs acronym and put it on a sticky note and slap it to their dash, then great, now it's a checklist. But the FAA is also very clear about the fact that operators are not to remove anything from a manufacturer's checklist. we can add things to the checklist, but we can't remove anything from the checklist. So those are the kinds of things that I'm referring to when I say we need to go by what the FAA says. And if someone does their whole walk around and then they look at their printed checklist, in my opinion, they reference the checklist. We met that requirement.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking at an old PTS, and the PTS does still, and it said the same thing, inspects the helicopter with reference to an appropriate checklist. This is a helicopter one, but but they all said the same thing. And GUMPS never has been a checklist. GUMPS was a flow. So I don't know.
Ultimately, what we're looking for is that a checklist is used in some manner. So obviously, if the checklist is sitting in a pouch inside the airplanes, that individual, in my estimation, did not comply with the task.
I just want to interject real quick. One of the things that I see commonly, especially during traffic pattern work, is people just doing the flows. They don't reference the checklist for each individual landing. So it's great that they know the GUMPS flow, like Joe said, but they're not doing the checklist. And I don't think that's taught enough by the CFI. It's 50-50. That's been my experience.
Look at the last bullet point I just brought up. So that's exactly what that is, Wesley, is I don't see where they're exempt from doing a checklist just because of doing touch and goes. Now, obviously, a lot of what we're doing are in fixed gear, fixed pitch prop airplanes. So it's not really going to be an issue, but we got to remember, what are we trying to do? Learning is a change in behavior, right? So we're trying to get them to utilize the checklist under all scenarios or aircraft types, not just the one where the gear is welded down and the pitch on a propeller is fixed. The whole idea is, while they may never fly anything beyond a 172, that's okay. 172 has a carb heat that's required to be on. It still wants you to put the fuel selector in both. There's still things on a 172 that still could get you in trouble. So I've still not gone out of my way, obviously, to bust somebody for that on a traffic pattern scenario, but encourage them that you need to keep using a checklist. And it's really not that much. And once again, I had instructors that would comment, yeah, but I don't want them looking down in the traffic pattern. Well, unfortunately, that's what, flying is. It's between inside and outside, and they're looking down when they're doing the checklist when they are approaching the airport or entering the traffic pattern anyway, because a lot of those things aren't done. But I've also mentioned to them, if there's 4 items on a checklist, nothing says you have to do all 4 at one time. If you want to look down and do one, look back outside, look down and do another one. That's what actually needs to be taught, is how to accomplish these checklists, as well as just plain doing them, but how can they be accomplished?
Hey, Phil.
Yes.
The another one that I think is open to interpretation. Well, first of all, we all know that there's the part in the back of the ECS. I think there's a whole paragraph that talks about checklist usage, and it talks about how, obviously things should be, priorities should be managed, things should be done at the appropriate time. That's all well and good and important. When I look at, say, the private or commercial ACS, and they've got the different landings, short field, soft field, normal, slip to land, whatever. If I remember correctly, skill number 1 on every single one of those is complete appropriate checklist. And we seem to have some instructors in schools that think it's okay to do the before landing checklist once and then do multiple landings, takeoffs, landings, pattern work, saying, yeah, we did the checklist. But why did the FAA, my question is, why did the FAA list that as a skill on every single one of those tasks? That seems to me to imply that we need to see that skill completed for each of those landings on the practical test. And so I think there's some confusion or a different interpretation on that as well.
And there should be, because one of those landings is a separate event. The fact that you just took off 3 minutes ago should have nothing to do with it. And let's keep something else in mind. The touch and go concept is not addressed anywhere, has never been addressed anywhere in a PTS or an ACS. It does not say that if you do decide to do a touch and go, did the applicant comply with all the checklists? Touch and goes are not even listed as any type of a maneuver on the check rise. If they're chosen to be done, they're chosen to be done. But we have very little to back us up if something is forgotten on that situation. But I don't think the intent was anything other than doing a checklist on every, and of course, the other one that's missed, we're talking about landings right now, but let's talk about the after takeoff checklist or the climb checklist, whichever one the manufacturer wants to call it. That obviously is missed as well in the touch and go scenario. So, or one of the things that needs to happen is those checklists still need to be complied with. Just because you just did a takeoff a few minutes ago, you're doing another one, and it's August, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. How's that oil temperature doing? How's that oil pressure doing? But we tend to blow that stuff off because we did one when we left on our faux cross country.
So my sense, Phil, is that like other things that have arisen over the years that we identify as a group, clearly this is a primacy thing. This is potentially a flight school thing. You know, the corrective action here is certainly from the top down, and that would be canvassing the flight schools as we've done in the past, and try to get the word out that, guys, checklist usage is not checking at one time at the beginning of the flight and then doing half a dozen patterns. Because once we get that word out there, then we're truly testing the pilot, the applicant, not what they've been taught. If it's okay at the school to not use the checklist for each maneuver, then that's how they're going to show up at the check ride. We all know that.
Yeah,
I agree. I know there's a few instructors that are not DPEs that they're on, and and some of us go to the AFTW. Obviously, Jim is attends and puts those together. So yeah, that would be something that we should kind of reemphasize, that hey, even during pattern work, they should be emphasized and completed for each task.
Well, I agree. And like I said, there's nothing that says you don't do it. So since the touch and go is not even listed as a maneuver in the ACS, we're on our own when we start doing that, that kind of a maneuver. But it doesn't matter. The guy or girl is doing a landing and they're doing a takeoff. And there are checklists associated with a landing, and there are checklists associated after takeoff or climb, whatever the manufacturer wants to call it. And I think that's how we need to try to tactfully get that across to everybody, is that takeoff is a separate maneuver. There's no association with the touch and go from a checklist standpoint. So that's why I have traffic pattern scenario down there, because that's the most common area where the checklists are kind of by the wayside. Once again, it does start at the schools, but we also have to be responsible for making sure these things are debriefed, briefed, and complied with. So as much as we know that in the 72, there's not a whole lot that could get us in trouble, but it only takes one thing. It only takes not putting the carburetor heat back in on takeoff. It only takes not using carburetor heat when you should be, or not having somebody bumps the fuel selector and you didn't check that it's on both, or the case of the low wing airplanes, the fullest tank. So this is why this was brought up. So any more comments on this?
Real quick, just on the comment of looking down to the checklist. I'm a big fan of what Jason Miller teaches on the finer points of holding the checklist up into your scan, whether it's an instrument scan or up even as high as the windshield, to divide the attention. That's a lot better than having the applicant put their head down. Since you mentioned instructors in this meeting or that might be watching this recording, I think that's a good teaching technique. Even if the checklist is on the iPad, it's not that hard to hold it up for a few seconds and make sure you didn't forget anything.
Oh, I agree. Let's go back to the first slides I was talking about. Single pilot resource management. That would be one of the biggest topics with that. Where do I, by myself, since I don't have Jim Pittman sitting next to me to hold my checklist for me and hand it to me when I ask him for it, even though he's not a pilot, he's a passenger, and I could very easily hand him the checklist, the card, whatever, and say, do me a favor, just hang on to this until I ask you for it. That's single pilot resource management. So along those lines, if I am by myself and truly am single pilot, where's a good place for me to put that checklist? Where's a good place for me to stow an iPad or to have an iPad mounted on my lap, on the yoke, suction cup to the window? These are all items that fall under single pilot resource.
Recording in progress.
We don't look at it that
Bill,
times. Yes. Okay.
so one thing, since you backed up a little bit there, under flight deck management and single pilot resource and that, one of the big items I think that we all are guilty of overlooking quite a bit is securing of all loose items, especially when they're single pilot. Securing of loose items in the cockpit, it's in the ACS, and very few schools even teach it until the day before their check ride, if they teach it at all. And the guy comes in and throws a 30-pound bag behind him, so on the seat in the back, especially if he's single pilot, that could cause him a lot of issues.
Yeah, and not strapping it in.
Right. They're not securing loose objects in the cabin in the cockpit.
And just to clarify, I don't think Joe is saying he can't put the bag back there because he's single pilot. There's obviously going to be some stuff in there he may want access to. Joe, you're referring more or less to the securing of that.
Yeah. Here you do a high-speed rejection and you have a 50-pound bag hit you in the back of the head. You know, and so few of schools even emphasize that to any of their students. And if they do, it's usually 2 days before they send them to me, and they go, oh, and you better tie those bags down in the back, or he's going to be all over you about that.
I know. And by the way, flight deck management is going to cover that in the next meeting. There's some items in there that you just brought up, but I'm going to throw that in the next one. That you're right. It's just not, that one's not taught very well. It's well, you know, Phil's going to get mad if you don't have that thing strapped in. So make sure you strap that in for Phil or Joe or whatever.
Yeah, they're not saying it for the right reason. They're not saying you're doing it because it's in the pre-flight option or the flight deck management portion of it. It says secures all loose items.
Right. That's correct. Regarding the memory items, there is not, I don't think there's really good training on the concept of what constitutes memory items versus non-memory items, or what constitutes an emergency versus a abnormal or non-emergency issue. So I think schools as well as us could do a little better training on the concept of what makes them a memory item. Is it something that's going to dramatically affect the flight right away, or is it something you can deal with later? For example, obviously, that low oil pressure is going to be a little bit more important than the loss of the alternator. How to sort out the prioritize the issues with that stuff. And you know, it's for the most part, the newer books are pretty good about bolding the memory items. Anything in bold is considered a memory item. But also that when you do go to the checklist, don't forget about the items you did from memory. You should start at the top of that particular checklist and make sure you covered the items that you hopefully did from memory. And this is something else that needs to be emphasized, is that when you pick up that checklist, start at the top. Don't pick it up from where you think you got the last memory item. Any other comments, even from any of the guests regarding checklist usage?
Yeah, Phil, David here. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm on my way to my car right now, so hopefully the signal didn't go in and out. Yeah, I brought up the issue of checklist usage. I teach primarily in the Cirrus aircraft. And what I see a majority of the time is that primacy thing when they begin to learn to use that checklist. And so they bring that skill forward with them, and it becomes only a read and do, to the extent that some of the people I've flown with have a slavish devotion to the checklist and forget to see the big picture with the airplane. So, for instance, they won't turn the battery switch on in the aircraft until the checklist directs them to do that. On the climb checklist, it says, engine parameters monitor. So they'll read that in the checklist. They'll look at the engine instruments, but not actually see the thing they're checking. So in our case out here, a good many times the cylinder head temperatures, are rising up into the yellow, and they don't even see that. They just checked it off in the checklist. So in the Cirrus curriculum, they do teach flows and then back it up with the checklist. So like you say, for the ACS standards, everything is going to be followed up with the checklist. So you have the 4 various methods, and I think it would serve the average pilot better to have a familiarity with those various methods of accomplishing a checklist, because whether you do a flow or a memory item checklist or a memory item, it's always going to be followed up with a written checklist. The issue is just when do you have time to get to that written checklist? So the one checklist that I've never seen anybody do in flying with students on up to ATP rated pilots and GA aircraft is I've never seen anybody do a climb checklist, and I've never seen anybody do a before landing checklist. So, because if it's just a read and do checklist, a lot of times, especially that before landing, you just don't have time. So a flow will accomplish that. And then hopefully you will have time at some point in there to reference the printed checklist. But more often than not, that doesn't happen.
I'm going to get into the emergency systems and equipment malfunctions later on here in a little bit. So we're going to talk about emergency checklists and a lot of the different ways to handle those here in a couple more slides. Any other questions regarding our basic checklist usage? These are all good comments. And once again, I encourage our guests as well, even after the meeting's over with, if you have some comments you want to make anonymously, that's perfectly fine. Same with the DPEs regarding some of this stuff. So the more input we have from both sides of the program, the better this stuff works out.
Can I ask a question here real quick?
Sure, Steve.
I have a 1972 version of a Cessna 172, and of course the POH calls for carburetor heat use, and when we're continuously doing touch and goes in practice, I don't like the students to use carburetor heat when it's like 100 degrees and 14% humidity and a lot of dust in the air. Is that acceptable, or do most people of DPEs disallow that?
Anybody want to answer that? Surely somebody does.
I would say that, if the applicant is aware of, what carburetor icing is, when it's susceptible, and the conditions that are currently, the environment that you're in, then as long as it's made reference and the reason why they don't want to use it, then I'd be okay with it.
I got a quick question here. What does it say in the checklist, on your checklist? Does it say checked, carburetor heat checked, or does it say carburetor heat on?
The POH says to turn carburetor heat on.
Okay. And the it says on, you're saying, and when does it say to turn it off?
after landing.
I gotta go look at the old checklist. I can't remember because many of them changed and they all said carburetor heat checked. Okay, and the reason for that was just because of this, because on some days you put it on, the engine's gonna quit almost, and so, and it's really not good for it in certain situations. But I can't remember on the old 1972 one, if it said on or if it said checked.
It
And
says,
if it-
just like Steve says, there's
Yeah.
some checklists when it comes to carburetor heat, depending on the manufacturer. Because you got Piper that doesn't even have you turn it on, unless you have a rough running engine. But it can say on, checked, or as required. And
Yeah, that was the difference in it.
so I'll give you my two cents.
I think that
Yeah, go ahead.
obviously they have to understand the carburetor heat, and if they can explain to you why why on certain situations they don't want to put that on, I think that's totally appropriate. But if he just says, I'm not turning it on because my instructor told me so, that's probably not an appropriate answer.
That is a tough one. We have an issue where do we draw the line on what we want to do and not want to do on a manufacturer's checklist? So, and what does this do for this individual who actually just did a bunch of touch and go somewhere and is now out on a trip where he's in a situation where he could possibly get carburetor ice, and he's just used to not turning it on. So it's a tough one, Steve. That's one of those things that, like Joe said, is he explaining why he's doing it? However, if for some reason anything should ever happen, and I always tell people this, I tell DPEs this, I tell instructors this, and applicants this, when you are standing in front of the judge, and I'll just leave it at that, and you have to explain why you did not comply with an item on a checklist. And that's as much as I say about it. So,
yeah, well, Phil, what you're saying is exactly true. I mean, so many people if they learn to fly in Phoenix and then they go back to Michigan and they're going to go give themselves in Great Lakes area, and they go back there and, nice 70-degree, 50-degree day or something like that. And they run a 172 and they were just told, we don't use carburetor heat, don't use it. And they have no knowledge of when to use it and when not to use it. Then we have a real issue because it's going to, probably give them some issues, give them a lot of trouble. They go run a Lycoming 172 and then they train in a Lycoming 172 and they go run a Continental 0300 172 and they better understand carburetor heat. So again, it just goes back to if they're not using it and for a purpose and they have knowledge of when and when not to use it, that's one thing. If they're just not using it because they're taught not to use it because it's Phoenix, Arizona, that's probably not acceptable. We may not even get to the airplane anyways, so it would probably be caught in the oral more than likely.
Yeah. This is a super sticky one and we're pointing that out. And I think I can see Phil over there. I can see your brain moving, Phil. We've had meetings where we talked about, I believe, airplane flaps, where we said, hold on one second, please. All right, had to interrupt you, where we've said, hey, the POH says this, how dare you come up with a reason not to follow the POH? But now we have found to us, legitimate reason to not follow the POH. So this is a tricky one. I do check rides at schools that don't need to be mentioned, that it is law written in stone that you do certain things because they've been operating these aircraft for 100 years and know that you don't want to turn the governor on here, or you do want to turn the governor off here, and it's not with the checklist. And do you swing in as a sole DPE when they have DPs on staff and say, oh, I'm busting y'all because you ain't following the checklist? No, they've been doing that for 20 plus years. And they have a really good reason that's actually based in scientific terms, be it spark plug fouling or what have you. So this is sticky and we probably shouldn't talk about it.
Well, Scott, I agree with you to a certain point, but even with your scenario there, okay, with that school that you're talking about, whatever, regardless of who the school is, okay, and they have good data that says this is why we don't do it and everything else, that's fine. But if the student's answer to me is, I don't do it because my instructor told me not to, or that's a whole different answer than if I say, why don't you do that? And he gives me a good explanation, which is the history that the school told them. If he's been taught why not to do it, that's one thing. If he's doing it just because my instructor told me, we got an issue. You agree?
I agree 100% with your scenario. I was just looking at it at black and white.
Yeah, well, it can't be just black and white if the guy's not being taught that. If he's being taught the reason, that's one thing. But if he's not being taught and he's only doing it by
Just by rote.
rote method, then I don't think that that's
Okay, agreed. And this is the last thing I'll say. If the checklist says go 10 degrees of flaps on base, if you don't have a safe reason not to do it, we have said in prior meetings on this same group that you had better be going 10 degrees flap on base. That's a fake example, by the way. So no, I agree with you totally, Joe. And no, I don't show up at that school and say a new sheriff's in town and raise ruffles. I let them turn the thing off and do it the way they do it because it's perfectly safe. And that's the way they've done it for 20 years. But, you know, I'm just saying this is a sticky wicket.
It is, but this is exactly when you say we shouldn't be talking about it. There's a gentleman there. Steve is trying to train people to get through, to train them correctly and get them through check rides. And this is exactly why I encourage our customers to come and listen to these things so they can hear what was just said. No, it's not black and white. And we have to realize, well, talking about CRM, ADM, and risk management is not black and white. You cannot teach common sense to people, but you can teach judgment to people.
Yeah, and I was being totally flippant, Phil. We should be talking about this.
I know.
Okay.
It's exactly, he asked a question that believe me, there's many more that I get on phone calls of these things. And I pop a couple in each one of these meetings. I'd like to hand you all 50 of them, but it'd be too overwhelming. And we'd be talking about it for days because we have different responses for these things. But the reality is that, yes, the car heat not being turned on in Phoenix in August under those conditions is not going to hurt anything. We have to figure out where the defining line is between not following it or having a reason to follow it. That's a tough one. But like Joe said, it's all about, do they understand? He said the word, if they're taught not to use it, and why. If they understand why they're not using it, that gives you a little bit of leeway. But the problem is, once again, down the road, if you're standing in front of the FAA law judge, and well, why didn't you do that? You know, because I've been flying out of Phoenix, Arizona for 2 years, and I moved here to Michigan, Joe's favorite place. And I don't know. So once again, how well did we affect the behavior? So that's something that, you know, is tough. Now, turning the carb heat on, I have seen actually an applicant do this where they pulled the carb heat on and said, I've turned the carb heat on. However, the situation here, I don't think is going to be good to be leaving the carb heat on. I've had them pull it on. Some of the carb heats, my 182 does this. When you pull it all the way out, the engine actually does start to run rough. So I have to push it in a tad. It goes to full extension. And some airplanes will do that. And I said, I'm going to push this back in until this engine runs smooth because it's just too hot for it. Now I see a situation like that. Well, of course, if the applicant understands why the engine just did what it did, it got way too hot. I'm going to push this back in partially till it runs smooth. I'm happy with that. They knew exactly how that system worked and what needed to be done to fix it. So yeah, these are tough ones, but those are questions that our customers out there would like to know, just so they can figure out how to get an applicant, you know, safely through these programs as well as successfully. So it's a great one. Anyone else? Okay. Moving on. Regarding IFR clearances, one of the issues that we run across in the instrument process is that the average applicant did one cross country, their long one that they had to do for the rating. And probably that might have been the only time they actually got an actual clearance. So someone was asking me how to solve this issue. And one of the things that that I did, I actually did it with a flight school that opened up a Chandler campus many years ago. And their first group of instrument students, I mentioned to their instructors to have them file IFR and get actual clearances from the tower many times. And they actually did about 10 or 15 of them where they were pretty well set with how to do that and how to set up the radios. And one of the issues, and I said, you can actually leave on your mission, they call them. You can leave on your mission with the actual clearance and then just cancel once you get airborne. Or in the case of Chandler, at times, because we're we're at a towered airport, but we're not kind of in the flow of things. We have to wait for our block of airspace to come over the top of the airport so we could be released. There's no problem with canceling it. What did you see? You got to see the individual actually copy a real clearance, set the radios up, and put an actual squawk in the airplane other than 1200. So one of the things for those of you out there that are doing the training portion is to actually have them file and get actual clearances more than that one cross country. For those of us given the check rides, I've always at times, whenever I could, especially at the Tower Airport, had them file a flight plan and get an actual clearance. Whether or not we got released on that, I didn't sit there and burn up gas for the sake of just getting released when it was backing everything up. But at least they got a chance to do what we're trying to get them to do, is operate in the real world with real world scenarios. So what happened is, the reason this came up was there was a examiner in Prescott that was trying to get an IFR release, and it kind of backed the system up because they have a little different program up there, not having radar all the way to the ground. So the issue was just to mention that while it's a good idea to get these clearances, if it's causing a delay, in the check ride or with the other traffic, maybe at that point, just go ahead and cancel and go off on our own and either pick one up later on or just press on with a simulated one. The other one is, if we are dictating simulated clearances, try to use real phraseology, real routings, instead of just fly heading 220 for radar vectors. Actually give them a place to go to and try using a squawk other than 1200. They can load it in the transponder and then just simply clear it out. So, once they're getting the airplane ready to go, let's get them to do their muscle memory and get in the habit of that. I've had many actual check rides take off with 1200 in the box. That looked normal to them. So that's the way they took off, because they weren't used to actually having to set the radios up for an actual departure, except on that one cross country of the actual cross country. And then understanding clearances with and without DPs. One of the things with lost comm that comes up is they're not taught in a lot of places that the lost comm procedures that they learned, the Avenue FMEA thing, doesn't apply to stars and SIDS. They actually have lost comm procedures stated on them. So one of the things that I'd like to see the group teaching the IFR students, as well as the DPs evaluating them, is giving them a scenario where, what if you did lose comms leaving Chandler out of 500 feet? Then they're going to start going through that acronym, trying to figure out what to do. Now, Chandler doesn't have a lost comm procedure, but big example, but a lot of airports do under DPs. There's actually a lost comm box, and very few individuals are even aware that exists for DPs and stars. So that's what I was trying to get across there that. Any comments on this?
Yeah, I've got one. I feel like I'm one of the only DP that tests going into the uncontrolled airports using actual ATC phraseology. Radar service is terminated, change to advisory frequencies approved, report your cancellation or downtime this frequency. And the applicant gives me the deer in the headlight looks because they've never heard that phraseology from their instructor. This has been something that I've shared with the AFTW work group. This has been something that I have to debrief. I feel like 80% of the check rides that I do.
Yes, and that's a next bullet point, which I didn't put up here that I'm going to cover is a way to fix that. That's unfortunately that's correct, Leslie. There aren't many that actually tell them as they're going into Casa Grande, because we do the stack, and it's not really the way that
Well, you can still do it after the stack, and I tell them that. I said after we depart the stack, maybe right before the outer marker or the final approach fix, I'll tell you that.
Yes. Well, but what I'm saying
What
is,
does that mean? I'll even debrief it before we get into the plane, just so that they're aware of that's my expectation of them. Because as I brief to them, I say, because this is what would happen in the real world.
yes. Well, once again, it takes getting to you before that happens. So what needs to happen is an expression to the some verbiage to the schools that you still need to teach them non-towered airport phraseology, not just from the IFR standpoint, but to make the calls in the AIM states when you are doing instrument approaches to non-towered airports. One of the things that can be done in this area that would be a great training aid and great help to this, like I had some of the instructors when I had the flight school, we would file IFR from Chandler to Hilo Bend. It's 30-year-old. File an actual IFR flight plan. The instructors file it from Chandler to Gila Bend. Well, guess what you get to do? You get to get the clearance from the tower, just like you would, anywhere else. And you blast off, you talk to Phoenix Departure. They're going to give you Victor 94, 95, whatever it is, to Gila Bend. And they're going to say, the airport's 10 o'clock or it's 12 o'clock and 10 miles, advise airport in sight. So they get an actual ATC directed clearance to a non-towered airport. And they would say, okay, airports in sight, they got two choices. Well, we didn't have cell phones way back then, so pretty much had to cancel in the air. I don't even think they had a telephone outside the building at Gila Bend at that point. They'd have to cancel in the air and do a visual approach and land. The backside of that was, okay, you've already filed. Hopefully, if you didn't, you would have to find a phone and call flight service and file a flight plan out of there. But the plan was to have them file a flight plan both ways. And guess what they got to do? They got to get a void time leaving Gila Bend, coming into Chandler. It's not that far away. It does more for you than spinning around in the stack or simply just flying, doing your turns and climbs and descents with no destination in mind. And it covers probably 80 or 85% of what you're actually looking for in a check ride. So once they get to that point, but if we could encourage more people to do that in this area, even somebody out of Falcon or somebody out of Glendale or somebody out of Goodyear could do this, could simply file. I don't recommend the Casa Grande one because of the stack, but there's no problems with going out to Gila Bend. You're going to get, they got to cut you loose because they can't see you all the way down, and then you get to exercise that whole process. But there's some food for thought for those of you that are teaching the instrument students out of this area is to fly a couple of those things. That's it's a wealth of information that they get just on one Gila Bend turn, and it doesn't take that long. Any other comments regarding that? But you're right, Wesley. It's something that could be added to the curriculum, is to actually discuss how you get in and out of non-towered airports, not just out. They know the void time concept, but and then have them actually do it a couple times so they can see what it's like. Anything else? Comments regarding that? Nope. Okay. All right. Our last meeting, we talked about the AFM POH preliminary pages. And here's just a copy of the letter that Craig sent back to us regarding that. Craig from the FISO sent back to us regarding that. And just to paraphrase, basically it was determined that a signature was not required on that page, or the serial number to be listed on the cover of the aircraft. However, I like that last sentence. They did say that they teach it as an industry standard. So once again, we have the top half of that saying one thing and the bottom half saying what I like is they did say that they taught it as an industry standard to have those signature and serial number on those pages. For those of you that didn't see the last meeting, we were discussing the AFM POH concept of what needed to be in that preliminary page at the front of that book. That's where this came from. Then the second half of that was here, where they can't enforce the information from, by the way, that came out of the PHAC when I posted it at the meeting last time. So they can't enforce information on a handbook or advisory circular. We knew the advisory circular. So basically, Craig, are you on?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a second.
Bill, were you just asking for me?
No, Craig. Craig.
Oh, okay.
No, Craig's there. And our discussion earlier today, to summarize this, was basically, these are our guidance, this is our guidance for testing. And basically what this was saying was that it can't be violated for something that's written in a handbook or advisory circular, which sounds odd, but that's what came out of all this was, this was not a Scottsdale FISO generated it's what they discovered from the FAA. So once again, anything that's in the 14 CFR parts is what's actually available or open for interpretation or violations. But anything we do with the handbooks, strictly like the advisory circulars, so we were surprised to see that, was just for our guidance. But from a regulatory sense, it couldn't be violated if there was no signature on that book. The last thing I'm going to do, oh, by the way, those are the parts down below that talk about documents required to be on board regarding POHs or AFMs. The other thing that I'm in the process of doing is finding out at what manufacturer's date started with that book being required to be on board. So with Cessnas, it's around 1978 or 79. I don't know exactly. Piper's did it, I think, a little earlier than that, and Beechcraft, I know, did it in the 60s, where they actually had a serial number specific POH/AFM for the aircraft. So just wanted to cover that from the last meeting. Craig, do you have anything else to add to that?
Not this subject, no.
Okay, all right. Let's see, any questions from the group on that? I know the DPE's got all the, got the letter from Craig. Okay, systems and equipment malfunctions. We have a tendency to just cover an electrical one and engine one, and maybe a landing gear one. There's so many more malfunctions that can possibly happen and have happened in the real world that I think we could vary our testing on and come out of our boxes a little bit on that. Each aircraft has its own unique emergency section in the POH or AFM for that aircraft. In other words, there's no little storm window on a Cessna, so there's not one in there for how to close the door, the cabin door, if it comes open like there is in the Piper. It tells you to open up the window. You're creating a lower pressure inside the airplane to help get that door closed. We should become familiar as examiners and instructors with not getting locked into the standard basic malfunctions that we have experienced in our testing process and go out a little bit and take a look at some of the other things that can happen in that particular aircraft and become familiar with it. It's in the emergency section of the POH's AFM there, section 3. And also, I'm still surprised at how many instructors and applicants I work with did not realize there's an amplified procedures in that section that gives you an explanation of why you're doing the items that you're doing, which helps an awful lot. A lot of the CFI applicants I work with have never even seen that and said, boy, I wish I knew that. I wish I knew that before. It would have explained to me, why am I opening up that storm window, or why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Because ultimately that's what we're looking for is that they have the understanding beyond the rote of why it is they're doing what they're doing. So just some food for thought for that. And something else that a lot of them have never experienced because I think it's as real as a total loss of the power plant is a partial power loss. It can change your decision making. And this is where we get into another concept of aeronautical decision making is what would the applicant do with a total loss of the engine versus a partial power loss? So as an example, in January, if I gave them 17 or 1800 RPM and that's all they were getting, what would be a reason that happened? Possibly a stuck throttle cable or a throttle cable that came apart. Because remember, those aren't spring loaded. So that throttle basically in most of the aircraft are going to stay where the throttle was when the cable broke or came off, which we saw has happened. It just happened a few months ago on an aircraft that had just come out of an annual inspection where the cotter key was not installed on the castle nut where it connects to the throttle arm. So in January, if I give them 1800 RPM over the green fields, they could actually fly that airplane just fine to Chandler. They could make it all the way back there. In July, what do you think? Aeronautical decision making. So the concept here is let's think more about as much about partial power losses as well as the total loss. They really are deer in the headlights look when you only give them 17 or 1800 RPM or whatever you want to give them. And they just look at you go, well, what's this? Well, engine anomaly. Oh, they have no idea what just happened there. So this can happen just as well as a total loss can in many cases, just as often. So just another thing to throw in our toolkit there, both for the instructors and the examiners is obviously if you give them a partial power loss on a check ride that they've never been trained for, unfortunately, that's not going to go over too well. They just have no idea what to do with partial power loss. Any comments on that? Along with systems and equipment malfunctions. Oh yeah, and last thing here is just ask them if they can explain why or explain the reason for why they're doing the procedure and the manner they're doing it. Either in the air, that's a good distraction for them, or on the ground in the oral portion of the test. Back to the emergency section, airplane flying handbook, is this figure right here. And this is what I was using for teaching and evaluating is these are basic generic failures that can be given to to the pilot. And it gives you the probable cause as well as the corrective action. So for anybody that wants to maybe look some things up and kind of, add some different scenarios to your testing. Here's one form right here. But once again, above all, make sure that they are aware of the fact that there's many other emergencies than just a alternator failure and an engine failure. There's many other things that happen and where to go to find that stuff. They tend to get just locked into those two other checklists. Same thing when it comes to spins. make sure that they understand when you're talking about stall and spin stuff, that the PARE thing is nice to know that FAA tells you that if the manufacturer does not have its own spin recovery procedure, to go ahead and use that process. But you'll find that even on some of the Pipers, especially the T-tail airplanes, they actually have the pull and the power off last. It's not the first thing you do. So make sure they understand that there's different procedures for different aircraft in their handbooks or their owner's manuals. Any questions on that? No? There we go. We had somebody wanted me to send out the data plates. Paragraph that I had from the last meeting. If you can, if you want to take a screenshot of this, otherwise just let me know who wants this. This is once again an item that is missed by instructors and some of us that needs to be on the airplane. Someone the other day got enlightened on this thing, looked at an airplane where the data information was done with a label maker. Keep in mind that that's not an approved method of fireproofing. That's just paper or plastic and will burn right up. So make sure we're all paying attention to making sure that the aircraft does have a data plate. It's just as important and required as the airworthiness or registration is. Any questions on that? Another examiner had called me up about seeing stickers placed on propellers that said "do not push." And Ernie, are you still on?
Bill, this is Greg. Ernie had to take off for another meeting.
Oh, he did. Okay. All right. All right. Give me just a second. I'll be right back. I've got to pull something up over here. I can't find it. I had some notes written down from my discussion with Ernie, but if you see an aircraft that has a no push or do not push sticker on the propeller, that aircraft is not airworthy. I know they're only stickers, but the Macaulay sticker and the Hartzell sticker, those were put on there and the propeller was balanced that way. But as soon as we start putting do not push or no push on propeller blades, we're not exactly operating an airworthy airplane. That's an aerodynamic control. So we want to be careful about that stuff. Also, if you see any placards on or in the aircraft missing or covered up, that aircraft is also unairworthy if they covered up some of the placards. So just be aware of that.
Hey, Phil, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Bill. Okay, so let's say that happens and they have to present an airworthy aircraft. If they say, all right, I'll just pull the sticker off, is that good? Or would that be a disapproval?
That's why, well, they've been flying it that way, right?
Yeah.
Of course, if they brought it into you, they flew into you that way. They obviously already flew an unairworthy airplane. We went through this many years ago with, somebody comes in with an airworthy airplane before he even actually physically said the test has begun. There were issues where a pink slip was issued before he even started the check ride because the applicant already brought into you an unairworthy airplane. We kind of got past all that and said, you can't really do one of those three things until we say the magic words. the test has begun. So either a unsat or a discontinuance or satisfactory. I don't know, Bill. That's why I wanted to see if Ernie was on. Because I did have that question, was what if these things were taken off? From a maintenance standpoint, I don't know, if hopefully none of the paint comes off with it, when you peel the sticker off. But that's got to be a call, I think, for each individual. DPE is looking at the big picture. Once again, we got to remember that, especially in the private pilot program, the majority of our applicants this is their first shot at this, and they're under the assumption that the individuals that are training them, have their ducks in a row. They are certified by the FAA to be doing what they're doing, and they look at them as they idolize them in the sense that what they're telling them is correct, and that's a tough call. I don't know, but I was hoping that Ernie could have stayed on here, because they did have that question come up, as what if they're removed from a maintenance standpoint or airworthy standpoint. As for a DPE standpoint, does anybody have any input they'd want to throw in there? Nope. Okay. Sorry, couldn't get an answer for you on that one, Bill.
Well, I kind of agree with you. I think it's more of a big picture issue. So I'd probably let it go. I don't know.
I wouldn't fly the airplane. If I saw stickers on there, I would.
Phil,
Yes.
Well, no, I wouldn't either, but if the stickers were taken off.
hey, Phil, when you get a chance to talk to Ernie, I'd ask him about this, because, okay, so what if the guy goes out and he paints no push on that prop, and then after he does that, he balances the propeller?
Well, yeah, I know. I'll
give you an example. My Stearman prop, we paint on that prop the all of the military nomenclature for the propeller. Okay, but that's what the military did. And but after I'm all done and I get the prop all done, I balance the prop and then I put it back on.
Sure.
So if you were to go look at the logbooks and it were balanced, I wonder what it would say. I know a lot of the stickers cause corrosion too.
Yes.
So that's one of the issues there, is because it'll, underneath that sticker, you'll get corrosion. But I'm just curious, when you get to talk to Ernie, call me back and let me know what he says.
I will.
The book might say it's balanced afterwards.
Yeah. What the question was once again, I had a DPE call and say, this guy's got stickers on the propeller, and in some other places, but is that legal? And the first thing I said was, I don't think it is, because it didn't come from the factory that way. It's the first thing I tell people is, how did it come from the factory? In your case, it came from the military that way. I would imagine that, all those entries would have to be made. I know that, painting the propeller is one of the things that is done by mechanics. And I don't know how many of them actually put the Macaulay or Hartzell sticker back on them after they paint them. So that, once again, that's one of those gray area type things, but I will ask them. All I did was call up Ernie and say, what's the status on that propeller with a sticker on it that was not put on by the manufacturer. He said the airplane is unairworthy, and then we left it at that. But I'll go further into it. That's why I was hoping. I actually had 3 questions today if he was going to stay here. Okay. Any other input from anyone? Nope. Okay. All right. Point of contacts. Jared, are you here? I guess not. And Kim, I don't think Kim is here from the Tucson area. Bill, you're here. Anything for the point of contact reports?
Nope.
Okay.
Not a thing.
All right. Jim, anything from your neck of the woods?
I think Jim's gone.
Oh, okay. All right. Todd's not here. And Brian Schultz. Brian, are you here? No. Okay. That makes that one go by pretty quick. Yeah. On the pre-test. Yes. Someone have a comment? Oh, Jared's there. Okay.
Yeah, I am. I really don't have a whole lot other than I continue to see a lot of at certain schools when they're doing flight logs. I see a lot of students getting mixed up when they start using their iPad using magnetic headings and then adding variation and other stuff to it, not realizing that they're starting with the magnetic, not a true heading, and they're messing up a lot of the math there because some of the nav logs haven't been updated.
Right.
But other than that, nothing from the schools that I've got back.
Okay. All right.
That's probably a topic for another time.
Sure. Sure. Okay. This about the last bit of stuff here is there was an issue where I think someone was asking for the written test information when they showed up for the check ride, because some examiners that were showing up for these rides were handed the something that the school made regarding that, other than the logbook entry, but they were under the impression that the examiners need that document that shows what questions were missed, and they're using that. So I don't know how a POH is, or a POA is created at that point, but I was just asked to mention it here that the test questions missed need to know by the DPE before the test can begin. DPE should have access to the written test prior to showing up for the test. Hopefully we're all doing it before we show up for the test, and also getting copies of some of the endorsements that we'd be looking for, and anything else that can give us as much lead time as possible before we show up and find out an endorsement's incorrect or cross country is incorrect. Anyway, presenting the missed questions when the DPE shows up doesn't give the DPE the ability to create the plan of action ahead of time. And we know that there just needs to be a training record or logbook entry verifying that the training did take place of covering those questions that were missed on the written test. I don't know how many of you actually have a form that you send to school or simply do it by phone call. Joe Stilley actually has a pretty good document that gets just about everything you need, including type of avionics in the airplane, which I think would help when you are creating your plan of action. Is, are you dealing with a glass cockpit? Are you dealing with a steam gauge airplane? These would all be helpful things before you get started out there. So as much information as you can get prior to the test is going to be very helpful to you to develop a plan of action, which, by the way, has to be written. Okay, standing topics. Any issues and problems anybody wants to talk about?
Hey, Phil, this is Bill. I had a weird thing happen the other day, and I don't know if I did the right thing or not, but I went ahead and did it. So I did a check ride. The applicant didn't have the 61105 endorsement for the written exam, and he did it one of those home study curriculums where then the sponsoring company is supposed to issue their own statement saying that the applicant has completed the curriculum and is now ready for the test. He didn't have that either. So I thought, well, this is the end of the check ride. We're not qualified to do this test. And then I thought, well, maybe if he called that company, they could send him a picture of that document saying that he completed the curriculum. Well, he did. He called the company, and they couldn't find a copy of a paper that they'd sent him to give to me. And but he handed me the phone. I spoke with an instructor from the company, and the instructor said, well, hey, I can verify that the applicant actually completed the curriculum. And he said, well, that suffice. And I said, no, I'd really like to see something. And so what he did was he typed up the whole statement saying that the applicant completed the curriculum, gave me his name, CFI number, and all of that. And to me, that was fine. I accepted it, and we did the check ride.
Okay.
Was that the wrong thing to do?
No, Craig. Craig, do you remember this conversation we had, Jeff, I think, was the one that was involved in it. We came up to the conclusion that he had to have something when he took the written test.
Right.
So by virtue of having taken the written test, and Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, that would suffice for us that he had to have something to show to the testing facility in the first place, and we did not need to see that. Is that correct, Craig?
I think so.
Yeah. So what you did was fine, Bill, but I think, and I think Jeff is gone. Or Jeff, are you on?
I
No,
think
he
Jeff,
had to leave.
he left too.
I will verify that again with him, but that just happened like, 3 meetings ago where that situation came up. And I think Jeff's was that he had to have something when he took the test. So while it may have gotten lost or whatever, we would accept that as being okay for what we need.
Okay.
Hey, Phil,
I remember
this
that,
is
but
Jared.
I don't.
That was,
Go ahead.
this is Jared. That was my issue. I brought that up a few months ago. It was probably at the same school because they were showing up for check rides without endorsements to take the written test. They had the written test completed, but my understanding was based on the AC where it lists all the endorsements they have to have. That was one of them. And if they didn't have an endorsement to take the written test, even though they'd already taken it, they didn't meet the requirement. So they had to go dig deep and find something that wasn't an actual endorsement from an instructor saying that they were authorized to take that knowledge test. If that's indeed the same thing we're talking about. So that's my takeaway is that I needed to see an endorsement for that knowledge test to get the check rate, even though they'd already passed the knowledge test.
All right, I'll get back. Make sure.
I got a quick question. Bill, did that instructor actually make an endorsement that he was signing him off, or that he had completed he supervised his ground training? How did he write it?
I can't remember the wording now, but it's not like he was his instructor. He could see in the records that the applicant went through the entire curriculum and it was check marked off in his system, so he could verify that it was done. And so then he just put it in a paragraph. Yes, the applicant completed the home study curriculum and signed it, blah, blah, blah. And so that was it.
And he
I was
signed it
happy
like
with
he signed it with a ground instructor and certificate or something, or what?
No, it was just his name and CFI number and expiration date.
Okay, well, we'll get an answer on that. So I couldn't remember. I remember that was Jared that had that come up.
Yeah, I do remember that conversation, but I don't remember that was our conclusion.
Yeah, I'll check on that with Jeff.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's see. Anything professional? Anything from best practices or plan of actions? 61 versus 141. Any feedback from schools or instructors? One thing real quick here, VGSI and glide slope not coincident. Does everyone know what that means from both the instructor and the DP's standpoint? It means that when you break out at minimums on an ILS, you're not necessarily going to see 2 whites and 2 reds. You may see 3 reds, you may see 4 reds, but that is not an unsat. If the person is on the glide slope and within the parameters of the 3/4 of a scale deflection, not 3/4 of a dot, that's okay. What we're seeing happening is individuals are freaking out about that, pulling the nose of the aircraft up and now actually becoming unstable, thinking that they got below the glide path. The glide slope and the VGSI, when it states they're not coincident, means they're not going to match. One, the glide slope electronic is for the ILS, the VGSI is basically for non-precision approaches. And actually, the only place I've ever seen those match is in Mexico, of all places. All the ILSs I flew in Mexico match up 100%. But up here, we'll see that. Just want to make sure everybody knows what that means, that what you're really looking for is not the VGSI. You're looking for that 3/4 of the scale deflection, not to exceed that when they're on the ILSs. Any questions on that? pattern flown by reference the iPad. Bill actually brought that up before, so we've already covered that. Holding pattern terminology, once again, there's protected airspace and non-protected airspace. There's not a protected side and a non-protected side. All sides of a holding pattern are protected. They're just protected to different radii. But there's no such thing as, when you look in the government books, you won't see protected side and non-protected side. That's still a terminology that has been carried over for so many years. It's holding side and non-holding side. So remember that anytime you do a parallel entry, you have to go to the non-holding side to do that entry. So there has to be some sort of protection there, especially if you're doing 230 knots. Any questions on that? We should be making the radio calls and the stack came up again. I think this is an AFTW issue that they can clear up. They actually try to a lot anyway, but remember, we're looking for the examiner to do anything that's a stack related call. We're looking for the applicant to do anything that's an ATC real world related call. Especially for those of you that are the instructors listening today. Any other comments on that? Brief prior to the flight, yes, it should. Okay. We don't really have any committees. I'm pretty much it. There's really nothing else. Jim, are you still on? Pittman, or he left, didn't he?
Yeah, Jim's gone.
Okay. All right. So I don't know of anything from the AFTW or the other issues. Craig, FAST team.
Yeah, just real quick, I do have one item. First of all, a great meeting, a lot of great discussion. That is really awesome. One of the things that we have had is so far this year, we've had 24 loss of control on landing items happen. Many of them seem to be for different reasons and involves just like every pilot certificate across the board. But, just something that I wanted to bring up to your group. It doesn't necessarily, these aren't necessarily, newly minted certificates, but just something to be keeping an eye out for is the skills on landing. In fact, do you mind if I do a real quick screen share, Phil?
Go right ahead. Does anybody know what happens when the time runs out on Zoom? Does it allow me to extend it?
I think absolutely nothing.
Good. Okay. Keep going.
Okay. All right. You're going to have to let me. I don't really need to. I was just going to show you what I have.
No, please go right ahead.
Now, it's telling me you have to let me. Anyway, long story short.
Let's see. How do I do that?
Maybe clicking on my name on the.
Hey, let's try that.
I think, Phil, maybe if you stop sharing.
Let's see. Make host. I can make him a host. Here we go. Yep, I'm going to make you the host.
Okie dokie.
There you go. Well.
No, it's working. It's working.
Okay, I'm still seeing my stuff though.
I know. I'm just now getting it.
Oh, okay. There we go.
All right. Are you seeing a Word document?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just kind of a list. I mean, just real quickly, I won't leave it up there long, but when you look through the list of airports, I mean, it's all over the place. So yeah, there are some repeat customers there. When you look through the certificate, at least for the ones we know, there's ATPs, there's student pilots, there's everything. But the reason that we're bringing this up is loss of control on landing is way up for this year. Statistically, it's double, maybe triple what it normally is. So just trying to make you all aware of it. Maybe on check rides, or if you're flying with other people, maybe flight reviews for the flight instructors. I don't know, doing training. Just keep an eye on the skills. We're not exactly sure yet. They each have their own individual reason, but one of the things that sort of comes to mind the most on this, outside of the mechanical issues, it might just be COVID rust.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I will stop that. Just wanted to kind of just give you a quick glimpse at that. I mean, and even the airplane types. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of training airplanes, but you know, you got a Bonanza, you got an antique jet, you got a Cirrus jet, you got a PA-46, a 210, a 310. You know, it's just all over the board.
Sure. Okay.
All right. But anyway, thank you. That was all I had on that. Just wanted to mention it.
Can you make, how do I make myself a host again? What's that? Anybody know?
You go up
More.
to your upper right corner and click in the upper right corner.
Click in the upper right corner under
Click the dots.
which dot?
Do you see a blue square with some white dots in it?
Where it says more?
Yes,
No.
right of that. Well, maybe Craig needs to make you the host since he's the host.
Craig, can you do that?
I'm trying.
Okay.
I'm looking. I'm not seeing where I can do it.
Well, click on my name. Oh, never mind. Reclaim host. I got it. I got
Well,
it.
I just figured it out at the same time.
Wait a minute. I had a reclaim host.
It just said you're the host.
It did.
You're
Okay.
back.
All right. All right, then there. Yes, I am. Okay, so let me get rid of this and go back to share screen. Actually, I was pretty much done with this anyway. So there we go. Okay. Okay. Thanks, Craig. Anything else from Fizzo?
Negative.
Okay. One of the things that you talked about, Craig, the landings, this is a tender spot with me is I really wish we were spending a little bit more time on the landings as more stop and goes or more full stop taxi backs and still throwing that forward slip to a landing into a separate event and not combining it with the other ones because the landings, as you proved right there, are still an issue. Okay, nothing else in the way of programs. Any other comments from the DPEs? Nope. Nothing from FISDO again. Guests that are still on board, does anyone have any comments?
Oh, thank you. That was very interesting.
Thanks, Lee.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Okay, the next meeting is going to be July 12th of 2021. That's the last one I think we'll probably have for the summer. August, basically don't usually have one. Now that we're doing a Zoom, it's different, but characteristically, a lot of people were not in town in August. That may be different now, but I'm not planning unless something comes up that Jeff, Craig, or Tina want to bring up to the group. But right now, July 12th will be the next one, and the next one will be after that will be in September. So thank you for participating. We do have an email me if you have any comments or suggestions for future meetings or what we discussed today. There's my Gmail address. And we now have Jim Pittman has gotten our old DPEAG email from John Walkup's facility over there. We did have one before, and he was able to track it down and get the password and stuff. So we do have one now. Most of you should have received an email from Jim inviting you to the YouTube channel as well. Please subscribe to it. That'll help an awful lot as well, and we'll be able to start putting more stuff on that as well. For those of you that are listed as guests, I will forward Jim's email to you, people like you, Lee, and stuff, where you can log on there and subscribe to it, and also be able to send Gmail that right now is just going to me through that email address. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Well, let's see. It doesn't shut down after 4 o'clock. Okay. So thanks a lot. Appreciate you guys attending and appreciate your input.
Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phil.
Adios.
See you later.
Thanks.
See you, Phil.
Adios.
Yeah.